I'm here with the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Honourable Geoff Regan, and he's going to show us a bit about the Speaker's office here in Centre Block.
That's right. Come on in. Welcome.
Thank you.
So it's, of course, an office that's a little more than 100 years old. Well, about 100 years old, because the fire happened in 1916. The old building burnt down except for the library. And this office was actually finished about 1921. And in fact, on the night of the fire, the deputy speaker who was in the chair had just become deputy speaker and was in the chair for his first time.
Okay.
And the place burns down around him. So that's not a very auspicious beginning. But in spite of that, they elected him speaker, or made him speaker. It wasn't an election back then. It was the prime minister would name and the opposition would second. So it was similar. And that was Speaker Edgar Nelson Rhodes, who was from Amherst, Nova Scotia. And it's the last time until I became speaker that there was any Atlantic MP as speaker. So for me, that's pretty neat. But Rhodes worked very closely with the chief architect for the design of this building, John Pearson. And they got to be quite good friends, so much so that Pearson actually had his people put the face of Rhodes above my head here, right there, in the ceiling. And what's kind of neat is that although there are the faces of three other speakers in the other three corners of the room, they're all British speakers. But of course it was 1921, so Canada was in many ways still a colony of Great Britain. And so I suppose it's not surprising you have symbols, speakers from Great Britain, part of our Westminster parliamentary heritage. But also you have things like the Order of the Garter, the highest honors in Britain, the English Rose, the Scottish Thistle, and the Irish Shamrock. Not because they were honoring us lowly Irish, who were considered, kind of second rate at that time, I suppose, but because it was part of Great Britain and part of the empire. And you also see the fleur-de-lis in various places all around the room, although perhaps not as prominent. 1921, again. So that's part of the interesting history of this room.
And there's some wonderful artifacts in here as well, right?
Yes, there are. Well, we have the most famous artifact in here, of course, is the Churchill portrait that was taken here by Yusuf Karsh. And Karsh came here on December 30, 1941. The war wasn't going very well, except that the Americans had just entered on December the 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, of course. And he went to Washington to meet with Roosevelt to persuade him to actually be more engaged in Europe than would be in the Pacific, and succeeded. And then he came here and made a very famous speech when he talked about, amongst other things, the French surrender early in the war. And he very famously said, the French generals told their government that within 3 weeks, England would have our neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. And the House of Commons roared with applause. Some neck. Roar again, right? And then he comes in, after he finishes his speech, he comes in here, he's in a good mood because the speech has gone well, but he sees a photographer set up with his camera and lights and says, why wasn't I told of this? And apparently his staff kind of chuckled at that. He says to the photographer, you've got 2 minutes. Lights up a cigar, as Churchill, of course, was wont to do. The young photographer, Yusuf Karsh, of course, who wasn't nearly as famous then as he became, asked him to remove the cigar for the photograph. And of course, Karsh wanted to capture the character of the guy who at this moment is the leader of the free world. And Churchill, he's the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, of course, he declines to remove the cigar. So Karsh digs into his bag and pulls out his light meter and walks over to Churchill, who would have been standing about here, and pretends to take a measurement of the light so he can adjust his shutter speed and aperture. But he says, forgive me, sir, and he grabs the cigar. He walks back to the camera, takes the picture, and that's the reaction he gets. And it becomes, perhaps, the most famous photographic portrait ever taken.
Taken right here in this room.
Taken right here in this room. Now, somebody who heard that story earlier this year was in the UK, I think this summer or fall, and dropped off something for me, which I thought was kind of remarkable. And it is the brand new British £5 note, which of course has not just an image of Churchill, but the exact same image, the same photograph, without the background. So you can't tell from this picture that it was taken in this room, whereas here, if you look at the background, you can see it's the same paneling as in this office. At any rate, I don't know how many Brits will know that it was taken in Canada, but we're trying to spread the word. So it's a remarkable thing. Whoops.
Now, the furniture in this room is just gorgeous, too. What can you tell us about the table and your desk, Mr. Speaker?
Well, Speaker Edgar Nelson Rhodes, who worked very closely with John Pearson, asked Pearson to design for him a table and a desk. And before I was Speaker, I had various occasions to drop in here to the Speaker's office, usually for receptions and so forth. But I never knew that these were the table and desk of a fellow Nova Scotian, who actually went on to be Premier of Nova Scotia. Rhodes was my province's Premier between 1925 and 1930, and then came back here and was Minister of Fisheries, the same job that I once held, and then, of course, the less important job of Minister of Finance. I'm kidding, of course.
These pieces will be coming into the West Block, you said.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
yes. So for me, it's very special and really quite touching to get to use the table and desk of a fellow Nova Scotian. There are a few more stories. I mentioned, I want to tell you about the faces in the ceiling for a moment. This is Speaker Lowther, who in 1921 brought us the chair, the Speaker's chair, which was a gift after the fire of 1916, I guess, the British branch of what was then called the Empire Parliamentary Association, now the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, decided to give us a new chair, a replica of the one that was in Westminster at that time, which was there from 1850 until the 1940s, when it was destroyed in the Blitz in the war. And in fact, because it's a replica of that one, and the new one they have came from the Australians and it's different, ours now is unique. So that's kind of special. But he brought that. This is the first British speaker, Thomas Hungerford. And over in that corner is a speaker who is very important for speakers and for the history of the development of the nature of the work of a speaker. That is William LENTHALL. And on January the 4th, 1642, King Charles I was unhappy with what 5 members of Parliament had been up to and wanted to arrest them on a charge of sedition. Now, as king, there would have been a word that he wouldn't have heard very much since he was a little boy. No. And in Great Britain, if you thought about its United Kingdom, who were his subjects? Everyone. So keep that in mind. He walks into the House of Commons, sees the largest chair there, the Speaker's chair, but figures that's for him, so he sits in it. He doesn't see the 5 MPs he's looking for. He says, they run off. And he turns to the Speaker and says, do you see them? And Speaker LENTHALL falls to his knee, and you wouldn't look at royalty, of course. In fact, saluting comes from showing that you're not looking at royalty, right? And he says these famous words, "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, except as this house is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here. And I beg your Majesty's pardon that I can give no other answer than this to what your Majesty is pleased to ask of me." So, very politely, no, and I'm not your servant here. So Charles I wasn't very happy, but amazingly didn't insist that his guards cut off the head of the Speaker. He marched out angrily, and he dissolved Parliament. One of the things that sparked the English Civil War, in which somebody was beheaded, King Charles I. But it established a few things. It helped to establish the authority of the chamber elected by the common people, who weren't all that common at that time, because it was only males and people with wealth who could vote. But as the franchise expanded, the importance of that principle expanded. Also, it established a rule that's been followed ever since, that neither the monarch nor the monarch's guards are allowed in the House of Commons in Britain or in Canada, and I presume the same would be true in Australia and in other Commonwealth jurisdictions. But I think the most important message is about the role of the Speaker. as the servant not of the king, not of the executive, not of the government, but of the whole house and of the house as an institution. And that is a very important lesson for all speakers.
Wonderful stories, yeah.
Well, so let's go next door here to the dining room, the small dining room. Actually, we're getting ready for the move, as you can see. So we have all these containers here ready to put things into, because it is a big, big job to do the move. And of course, we're not just moving my office, obviously. We're moving the House of Commons itself, the offices of the Prime Minister and of the Opposition, all of the House leaders and whips. So it's a substantial undertaking. And of course, the clerks, the procedural folks are all moving, people from Hansard. So it is a big job to move all those people in a fairly short time.
And you have in this building your own apartment for the
Yes.
set aside for the speaker.
Let's
Shall
go
we
have a look.
Have a look.
We'll go through this enormous kitchen on the way. Monsieur, ça va bien? Excellent, merci. So, do you want to have a quick look in this room just for an instant?
Sure.
So, along these walls of the north hallway at the House of Commons end of the building, we have the portraits of former speakers, and some more of them are here in the speaker's dining room, the large dining room. In fact, these portraits actually go back to 1815. And here we have the portrait of Louis-Joseph Papineau, who of course was the leader of the rebellion in Lower Canada in 1837, which probably explains why his second stint as speaker ended in 1837. I remember in high school writing a paper on him. So I've always was kind of an admirer of his. It's kind of neat to have his portrait here along with these other portraits. And you can see how since that time, the outfit of the speaker has changed. I don't have these ruffles.
Somewhat changed.
Somewhat changed, and yet not all that much. All right, we can go on to the apartment now. As you know, the House of Commons is over here, and on both sides are the lobbies, the government lobby and the opposition lobby, and I served in both. And so during the times that I was in government, often came out that door, but never really paid much attention to what this door might be for and what was behind it. And I really didn't know. I guess I knew that the speaker was the only person who was allowed to sleep in the building. And I'd heard at some point that there was an apartment. I have no idea where it was. Well, here it is. Come on in. So actually, when I got here, there was a bed here, and in there was the living room, because Andrew Scheer, of course, had 4 young children. And so they would use that room probably to do their homework and so forth while he was working, and that made sense for him, therefore, to have the bed out here, which wouldn't be quite as quiet as farther in, but it worked well, I'm sure. And so this is I guess you'd call this the living room. And one of my staff had the idea that we should have a Murphy bed. So hopefully it's made. Oh, it's looking good. But so if the house sits till midnight or later, for example, I can crash here, and then I'm ready to go early in the morning.
So how frequently would you make use of this?
I've probably used it less than 10 times.
Okay.
When the first time I did, I woke up, I went to bed at about 12:45 after the house finished at about 12:30, and went to sleep 12:45. Around 3 a.m. I hear this grinding noise that sounded like what I think a masonry saw would sound like. And it was coming from the inside, whereas the construction site was outside. It made no sense to me. Nevertheless, picture me walking down to the guard's desk under the Peace Tower in my pajamas and bare feet to say to them, "Can you get this noise stopped so I could sleep?" And 15 minutes later, they managed to do that. And then at 6:35 in the morning, the sound we all knew for so long when they were using the big power jackhammer, bang, 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 started up, and I knew that was it. So up I got. So after that, I decided and I learned later that they were working on one of the towers that night above us, but I decided it didn't make sense to sleep here during that period. And so back here, there's a little changing room and a washroom. And that's about it. So it does the job, right? But as I say, for the times when you're here late at night and you're gonna have an early morning.
Right. Airbnb the rest of
As far as I know, the only person who's allowed to sleep in center block is the Speaker of the House. Now, having said that, you know, I've never asked the Speaker of the Senate if he has an apartment, but I haven't heard of it.
Yeah.
So I'll have to ask George about that. Speaker Fury, I've known for many years, as he and I and Elizabeth May were all classmates in the class of '83 at Dalhousie Law School. Okay. So how about that?
So now in the West Block, will you have a similar accommodation? Or?
It's all smaller, quite a bit smaller, but there is an apartment there, a place again with a bed, and my office over there is smaller. The only thing that will be larger in the West Block is the actual chamber, the House of Commons, the interim House of Commons. And the good news for members who are now, if they're in the back 2 rows, they're on benches, and if you're in the middle of the 5 seats, you have to get 2 folks to move out so you can get into your seat. Yeah. Well, that won't be the case anymore. Each member will share a desk with one other, so they'll all be able to get in and out much more easily. Instead of 5 rows on each side, there'll be 6.
So when this building closes, obviously the history, the sense of history here will be lost for a while at least, for 2 parliaments at least. But in the West Block, will your job change or be easier or more difficult?
I don't think it will change all that much. However, it's a historic building, but not nearly as much so as this one. And it doesn't have nearly as much in terms of the carvings we have in this building. And the Speaker's office is much more plain, much plainer. But I think it will be serviceable. It'll work just fine.
Well, I want to thank you so much for showing us around, taking on this tour of this special place, and good luck across the way in the West Block.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Pleasure. Thank you very much.
We'll take a cup of kindness, yeah, in the days of old lang syne.